Chapter 6. Retreat to the Self. I had several weeks before I was expected in Morocco to continue my study of Sufism, so I flew back to Chile to visit my friends and family and to give away my possessions. My parents picked me up at the airport, and I told them of the inner process I had experienced with Otis. I also gave them my forgiveness and my love. I spent my first night at their home talking with them about my personal journey. The next morning, I drove their car to the high-rise building in Santiago, where I had kept an apartment for the past 3 years. I got into the elevator in the building and started hunting for my keys in my suitcase. I arrived at my floor before I found the keys, so I got off the elevator and walked down the hall to my apartment door. I tried the door handle, and it wasn't locked. I opened it and carried my bags inside. Cushions, pillows, books, papers, and cassette tapes lay in heaps all over the floor. It appeared the friend to whom I lent the apartment during my year in California, a friend I had met during my years in college when I was active in the student movement, was no longer living there. It also appeared that someone had broken in. The chairs, sofa, and table had all been turned over or were on their sides. As I surveyed the scene with my mouth open in shock, a woman who lived down the hall entered and said, "The junta has taken them away." I was shocked by her words. I knew the junta's coup against the Hollande government occurred while I was in the United States. I'd heard the junta had burned all literature related to socialism, since my book, The Ebb and Flow of Living, contained a prologue by Pablo Neruda, and since Neruda, even though he was a mystical poet, had been a communist presidential candidate, it was not a complete surprise that my apartment was turned upside down by the junta. But I wasn't sure who the woman from down the hall meant by them. She explained that my friend, who was also a psychiatrist, had invited one of Hollande's relatives to stay with him while I was in California. When the coup occurred, she said, the two of them were disappeared by the police. "Do you know what happened to them?" I asked with obvious desperation. I knew that if no one had heard from them, they were probably dead. She shook her head. "Many who were taken in the past few months are never seen again alive. May God have mercy on their souls." She backed out of the apartment and left. I looked around my apartment and began to cry. I did not care about the broken furniture. I was going to give it all away. But I knew I had lost another friend to fear and the inability of men in power to see that we are all connected with each other. My countrymen were killing each other, and I was powerless to stop it. I thought back to a dinner in Berkeley months before. I was out with Jeffrey, his friend Patty, and an Armenian friend named Anton. Anton was a writer, and Patty said he was feeling very depressed, so the three of us had met with Anton, talking with him for hours about his problems and fears. I confided in Patty at one point, when Anton had left the table, that the young man seemed like he might commit suicide, so she might want to check on him regularly over the next few days. Eventually the discussion shifted to politics, and from the political instability of Anton's homeland to the instability in mine. Patty had read that President Hollande's rule was now being challenged by the military generals, and speculation was running toward a coup in the making. "The CIA has a grudge against Hollande," I said, "so if there is a coup, he is sure to be killed." When I was serving as a medical officer in the Chilean Air Force, I was stationed in Panama. One night at a bar, I heard some CIA agents talking. I was with a group of Chilean soldiers, and the men from the CIA, who were very drunk, I might add, told us that if we would kill Hollande ourselves, we would save them a lot of time and effort. The day following our meeting with Anton, I returned home from a meditation group meeting to find a note from Jeffrey next to the telephone. He wrote that Patty had called to tell me I was right, that he was dead. I tried calling Patty back, but there was no answer. I phoned Anton, who answered the phone still a bit depressed, but nonetheless alive, so I realized Patty had meant President Allen's death. I wondered how many other friends had been disappeared for their political affiliations. I walked into the bedroom of my ransacked apartment. Here, too, were clothes and papers strewn about the floor. I noticed a corner of my mattress on the floor underneath everything, so I cleared off the mattress, found a sheet, and threw it on top, and lay down to rest and meditate after the long journey from the United States and the sudden emotional turbulence of coming face to face with a repressive life under the junta's rule. The next day, I had my telephone reconnected. I started calling all my friends to find out if they were all right. Over the course of the week, many of them came by to see me. I managed to leave the apartment pretty empty when I set out for Morocco. Whenever friends came by, I asked them if they wanted any of my things. I also visited my parents that week. I brought my diplomas, licenses, and other important documents for them to hold for me. And I had them store a Persian rug that had been my grandfather's, and that I felt a deep connection to. My parents were still in good health and doing as well as could be expected in the midst of the political and economic upheavals. I had dinner at their house on several occasions, and I sensed some change in our relationship. We did not talk about it, but we seemed to treat each other differently. There seemed to be more friendliness and respect in our interactions than I had ever noticed before, and I saw wisdom and strength in their faces when I looked at them now. Driving home to my bare apartment on my last night in Chile, I recalled how much more open and expressive my mother and father seemed at dinner. My father told me some stories of his youth I had heard many times before, but this time I listened with a different heart. For the first time, my mother told me with openness about her relationship with my father before I was born. At one point, my mother told me she was glad I was exploring all these different religious traditions. "I thought you disapproved," I told her. "Oh, no," my mother replied. "Since I was a little girl, I always wanted to taste some of the other traditions. Buddhism, Sufism, Hinduism, all of those fascinated me when I read about them in school, but I never felt like I had a chance to try them out like you're doing. I have something from your childhood I would like to show you." My mother left the room and returned with a pillow. My mother had embroidered a design on the top of the pillow when I was a baby, a design that I later found out was based on an Oriental design which came from colander. She told me that when I cried as a baby, one of the only things that calmed me down was looking at this design. The pattern on the pillow seemed to calm my brain and cause me to relax. It was a positive surprise for me to see that my mother was interested and had read about many of the traditions I was experiencing firsthand. My life had become a living expression of her own visions. I kept asking them questions about what they had experienced in the year I was in California, trying to figure out what had caused them to become more open and centered. Their answers were somewhat brief, and I could tell they were using discretion in order to save me from experiencing their hardships. They said it was similar to what they experienced during World War II, that they felt the same type of fear. They had continued to work, visit relatives, and maintain their house and garden. Certainly the takeover of the government by the military had been frightening, but it hadn't substantially changed their particular lives. "Nothing has changed for you in all this?" I asked in frustration and amazement. "There are no more lines for bread and milk," my mother replied. "Oh, there is a curfew," my father volunteered, "but we haven't been out that late in quite some time." It was not until that night, lying on my mattress, that I realized what had happened. The inner healing work I had done with Otis had transformed my relationship with my parents. This realization enabled me to clearly see the changes that had been wrought in our relationship. Although a large number of people have worked with their inner child, most of them have become attached to justifying negative experiences of pain in their lives with their inner child, thus perpetuating their addiction and their need. Otis showed me how to mature my inner child, how to maintain my qualities of a childlike nature, but remove my childishness. I decided to incorporate this process into my own therapeutic bag. My relationship with my parents became a means of uniting with them. It transcended the family and cultural programming, as I later discovered, and opened me to true soul identity. I understood the respect and the honor I gave my mother and father. Their honest, loving presence in my life unlocked a door inside me. This door took me from a world shaped by my parents' influence, their DNA, their life experiences, their humanness, to a world shaped by cosmic DNA, that which is life itself and has been passed down from the first life on this planet to all living beings. I was no longer just the son of my mother and father. I was a child of the universe, of the life force. I thought about the fifth commandment God gave to Moses, honor thy father and thy mother. I had always suspected that particular commandment had more to do with maintaining the social order than maintaining a connection to spirit. But I started to realize that when you honor your parents, you are indirectly honoring yourself. I used to joke that I was the product of an egg and a successful sperm, but we are all more than that. Through our genes and our childhood experiences, we are very much a blend of the good and bad qualities of our parents. When I respect and honor the good qualities my parents passed on to me, I honor that part of myself, too. This made me think of the wonderful characteristics that my parents passed down to me in my early childhood education. They taught me the importance of speaking my thoughts freely and honestly, without fear, and of honoring freedom of expression in all people. They taught me tolerance, standing firm enough in one's own beliefs to be comfortable with and not threatened by the different beliefs of others. Through their bond of unconditional love, they showed me how to be committed and engaged in pursuit of my goals through self-discipline. My father was a man who always kept his word and always carried through on his commitments because he was self-disciplined and had a sense of responsibility. They also taught me about courage to be oneself and to persevere. They were engaged to be married during World War II in an area called Bukovina, now in the Ukraine and Romania. They had to survive not just the physical adversity of the war, but also the strain on their relationship. My father was captured by the Nazis and deported. This separated my parents for 7 years, but they honored their commitment to each other. They also taught me about faith in a higher power, in our personal path or destiny, in God. After my work with Otis, the values that I received from my parents were purified or cleansed of misunderstandings, and I could now appreciate them. I also realized that the process I had been through was needed in the world at large. The same values and characteristics passed down to me needed to be cleared of misunderstandings associated with them, so they could benefit all of humanity. During the time I spent with my mother and father, I wrote entries in my journal detailing the changes that had transformed my life and my relationship with my parents. I collected these writings sometime later, and they became a book of poetry titled Child of the Universe. This time with my parents was a crucial follow-up to the inner child work I did with Otis, and completed the healing process. My stay in Chile brought me much closer to them, which they also sensed and responded to with even more openness. The next day, I was on a plane crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Because there were no direct flights to Morocco, I chose to change flights in the Canary Islands. Alfredo, one of the friends I had made while studying at Salem, was a native of the Canary Islands and had invited me to visit him. I planned to stay with him for 3 weeks, relaxing and learning more about the self-development center he was starting. My flight landed in Las Palmas, on Grand Canaria Island, but since Alfredo lived on Tenerife Island, I had to transfer to a small 9-seat twin-propeller plane to Santa Cruz on Tenerife. When I got out of the little plane at the airport's single runway, Alfredo was there to greet me. He was a man in his 50s with thinning gray and black hair. He wore a short-sleeve white button-down shirt, shorts, and sandals. "Carlos," he said as he gave me a big hug, It's so good to see you again. It's only been a few months, my friend, I told him. I picked up my single suitcase off the luggage cart, and we walked toward the terminal building. I passed quickly through customs and put my suitcase in the back seat of Alfredo's dusty white Jeep. We set off down the coast from Santa Cruz to his ranch just outside San Miguel on the southern tip of the island. We caught up on what we had been doing over the several months since we met at a sailing, but eventually he told me to enjoy the scenery, and he drove in silence. I was pleased to follow his directive, for the scenery was spectacular. He told me that the Canary Islands include several different climates, and I had already seen two. The drier foothills of Santa Cruz were changing into a virtual rainforest as we headed south. The trees and other vegetation on our right, and eventually on both sides of the road, were thick and filled with the calls of monkeys and exotic birds. I thought back to my days at Assailin several months before. I had met Alfredo during the second week of my training. At that time, he had been in Northern California for several months, and was seeking out individuals who might be interested in recreating the atmosphere of Assailin at his ranch in the Canary Islands. He had actually lived in Pondicherry, India for several years, during which time he had become a disciple of the Hindu guru Sri Aurobindo. Over the following weeks, he told me more and more about Sri Aurobindo and gave me his guru's book, The Adventure of Consciousness. Before meeting Alfredo, I had always seen the practice of yoga as a physical and emotional practice. Through some yoga meditations Alfredo had taught me, however, I was starting to realize that yoga also offered a path to self-attainment, or soul awareness. I was particularly intrigued by a meditation technique he called the Eyes of God. In it, you imagine looking at the inside of yourself from imaginary eyes near the back of your head. You watch your real eyes as they look out and observe the world around you. This reminded me of a Sufi meditation Horst taught me at one of the meetings of the Tariqa in Santiago. The Sufis believed there is a concealed head behind and above your real head. It is through the eyes of this concealed head that you can look down on yourself from above and observe what you are doing as if you were observing someone else. You see others and yourself from a higher perspective, less caught up in obscuring emotions. The ranch covered several hundred acres at the foot of a steep cliff. The road to the main house was rather bumpy, but thankfully it wasn't too long. The main house had a lovely garden in front and overlooked the ocean from the top of a big hill. Alfredo parked the Jeep and directed a servant to take my suitcase toward one of the many cottages nestled further back against the foot of the cliff. The two of us proceeded into the house for late afternoon drinks. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, Alfredo introduced me to others he had gathered there to start his personal growth center. There were therapists, body workers, healers, and meditation teachers. The setting was as idyllic as Assailins. "We even have hot water to soak in with a view of the ocean," Alfredo crowed, when I pointed out the similarity. Alfredo told me I would be welcomed if I decided to stay. On several occasions, my enthusiasm about staying would build. Then something would happen to urge me on to Morocco. One day, Alfredo and I rode camels down to a cabin on some property held on the other side of the road on the ocean shore. I was feeling quite engaged by this majestic environment when I happened to notice one of the camels snorting and pushing something that looked like a book around with its nose. I went over and picked up the book. Many of the pages were wet and torn, and the cover and first dozen or so pages were missing. I turned to the first dry page, somewhere in the middle of the book, and started reading the Spanish there. "You need to find yourself. This should never be a hobby. You should not rest from the search. The search is the most important thing." The words seemed prophetic and at the same time familiar. This is what I needed to hear. I couldn't give up the quest for knowledge so early in life, I thought. I needed to go on to the Sufi community in Morocco, I decided once more. As I paged through the rest of the book, a female character the author loved intensely reminded me so much of Françoise that I finally realized I had happened on a copy of my own book, The Ebb and Flow of Living. Original intention. I set a date to leave. On the eve of my planned departure, I finally got to see the hot springs Alfredo had been telling me about. Despite my earlier decision, once again I had been wavering back and forth on whether or not to proceed with my plans to go to Morocco. Here, I rationalized, with much urging from Alfredo, was a perfect environment for me to work and teach what I had learned in healing and soul awareness. But there was an unsettled feeling in the pit of my stomach. My mind was drawn to stay, but my soul kept urging me to move on. As Alfredo and I rode in the jeep up the road to Pico de Tete, the huge steep mountain in the center of the island, Alfredo was once again pressuring me not to leave in the morning for Morocco. You could set up your own clinic, he said. People would come to see you from all over the world. If these hot springs are as wonderful as you said, I joked with him, perhaps I'll change my mind and stay after all. As we climbed to the higher altitude on the mountain, the palm trees gave way to shorter trees and shrubs, and the air grew colder. Looking up, I could see a glacier making its way down a crevice between two peaks. All of a sudden, the jeep's engine died. Alfredo immediately set the emergency brake and tried to restart the engine, but it would not kick in again. We both got out and lifted the hood, trying to find out what was wrong with the vehicle. Alfredo propped the hood open, and as we stood there scanning the engine, I heard a voice call out, "I have released you from bondage. Do not place yourself in bondage again." I looked at Alfredo. He looked at me wearily. "Did you hear that?" Alfredo whispered, his brow wrinkled inquiringly. "I heard something." "What did you hear?" I said. "I heard a voice say something about keeping out of bondage." "That's what I heard," I exclaimed. "What do you think it means?" Wondering if our senses betrayed us, we started looking around to find the source of the mysterious voice. We looked in the scrub and the bushes, but we didn't see anyone or anything around us. We seemed to be alone on the road. "I think it means you should stop chasing around all over the world at the beckoning of your ego," Alfredo said. "You should settle down and work in a free environment, like my center." "I'm not sure what it means," I replied, shaking my head incredulously. "All I know for sure is I did hear it. It's a sign of some sort." We stood in silence, pondering the mystery. Eventually our attention turned towards the car again. "I smell gasoline fumes," I said. "I think the engine is flooded. We should just let it sit a while before restarting it." "That sounds like as good a plan as any," Alfredo replied with a smile. I was grateful for the chance to think more about the voice and what it had said. About 10 minutes later, we were on the road again. We soon arrived at the hot springs. On a plateau just below the tree line, a stream flowed, steam rising from its surface. The spring was very hot, so it took some time to build dams to regulate a more tolerable water temperature. We took off our clothes and sat in the steaming water for a couple of hours, rarely talking. I looked out at the clouds, the ocean, and the other islands in the distance, and found myself once again in confusion. Was running away to yet another new place a form of bondage, as Alfredo had suggested? After my prayers and zikrs, or repetitions the next morning, I made my decision in earnest. The voice had been reminding me of my earlier intention, just as the copy of my book had days before. It was not yet time for me to give up what I had learned to others. The quest for greater and more consistent soul awareness had to continue. The bondage the mysterious voice spoke of concerned my being too settled in the past. I was in danger of going back to a routine that obscured my essential identity. I informed Alfredo that I would indeed be leaving. I left with him some journals I had written and tapes I had recorded while working with the Israeli physicist Moshe Feldenkrais in Northern California. Feldenkrais had guided me through a month-long personal training program on body awareness and mature behavior. The written and taped record of this work was my contribution to Alfredo Center and left open the door for me if I wanted to return sometime. He drove me back to the airport in Santa Cruz. He wished me well and invited me to come back whenever I wanted, but I never stepped on this farm again. Within 2 hours, I was on a plane bound for Casablanca, Morocco. Customs inspections in Casablanca, luckily, were also relatively brief, since I had only minutes to catch a connecting flight to Tangiers. There, representatives of the Sufi community would take me to Meknes. As I was in line to get on the airplane to Tangiers, however, an older man just ahead of me in line collapsed. As a doctor, I had taken an oath to render aid whenever and wherever it was needed. So I went to the man and checked his pulse and breathing. His heartbeat was irregular, and his breathing was fast and shallow, so I assumed he had suffered a heart attack. A crowd started to form around the fallen man and me, so I urged the onlookers back, asking one of them to help me move the man out of the way. I glanced up several times while waiting for paramedics to arrive, but the airline refused to hold the flight, and it took off without me. When the man was conscious and safely in an ambulance, I looked into another Royal Air Morocco flight to Tangiers and found that there wasn't one for several hours. There was no way to contact the representatives scheduled to meet me in Tangiers. I left my name with the airline after I reserved a seat on the later flight, in case the members of the Sufi community called the airport looking for me. When I arrived in Tangiers late that night, I hurried to the place where I was supposed to meet the representatives from Meknes, but they were not there. I was, after all, several hours late. I found a room for the night and tried, as I've learned to do, to find the lesson in this particular bit of adversity. I fell asleep thinking I probably wouldn't figure it out until later. The next morning, I headed toward the train station to see if I could go to Meknes on my own. I entered the crowded and chaotic terminal building. I couldn't read the signs. No one seemed to speak Spanish or English, and so I couldn't get directions from anyone. Eventually, I found myself on one of the train platforms, still being pushed and bumped by the crowd. A young man suddenly burst through the crowd, put his hands on my shoulders, and steered me toward one of the trains, saying in Spanish, "The train to Meknes is leaving. You have to hurry." By the time I got on the train, the young man had disappeared. But upon checking with the conductor who sold me my ticket, I was indeed bound for Meknes. The train ride took 9 hours. The distance to Meknes was rather short, but at every stop, passengers pushed through the crowded platforms with their sheep, goats, and dogs to get onto or off the train. And vendors walked up and down the length of the train, selling their wares to passengers leaning out of the train windows. We also stopped 4 times in the middle of the desert, and I and all the Muslim passengers, that is almost everyone on the train, disembarked to face east and say prayers. I had learned the prayers and the excerpts from the Quran in Arabic from Ian before leaving Berkeley. When the train got into Meknes that evening around sunset, I took my suitcase and my sleeping bag into the terminal and tried to gather some information on the location of the Sufi community. The map was thankfully in Arabic and Spanish, so I determined I needed to go to the old city, the Medina. I left the terminal and looked for a bus stop or taxi stand, but there was none. I saw a young man waiting along the road. A car stopped a few feet beyond him, and he went to the car and got in. I figured I would probably have to hitchhike into the Medina as well. I planted myself where the young man had been and stuck out my thumb to the passing automobiles. After a few minutes, a Moroccan man driving a red Fiat pulled up beside me. "Hop in," he called out in English. "Thank you," I said as I put my suitcase and sleeping bag in the back seat and sat down beside him in the front seat. "Can you take me to the Medina?" "Ah," he said with a broad smile. "Do you speak Spanish?" "Yes, why?" "I thought so from your accent," the man replied. "That is much better. I need more practice with my Spanish. Close the door. I can take you to the Medina." He was a student and seemed overjoyed to have someone with whom to practice one of the many languages he spoke. He occasionally substituted a Portuguese word, another of his languages, but for the most part his Spanish was as clear and idiomatic as his English. He gave me a brief history of the area and told me about the local architect. The homes in Morocco all look the same from the outside. They are square buildings with no windows. It is very difficult to distinguish the home of a pauper from that of a prince. It is only when you go inside, when you see what lies within the walls, that you can tell how your host lives. Each home has an open courtyard in the middle, usually with a lime tree and garden growing there, and it is the beauty that exists here that a Moroccan homeowner is most proud of. He dropped me off at the gates to the old city and sped off with a wave and a smile. I wandered through the stone gates, scanning the narrow streets for the few pedestrians visible in the twilight. I spied one man wearing a Western-style suit amid the many men in turbans and jalabas. So I approached him, saying the name of the community I was seeking. "Habib-Yazaya?" The man's face became a mask of disdain. He spit at me and cursed me. It was not until several weeks later that I learned the motivation behind his hatred. He had been happy to help me, a Westerner, which he aspired to be himself. When he heard me say I was looking for the Sufi community, however, his admiration disappeared. Here I was, a Westerner, with all the advantages, throwing away my life and material goods to join what he viewed as an antiquated, primitive cult. I wandered deeper into the Medina, where the streets became more narrow and the street lights further and further apart. At one dimly lit intersection, a crowd watched four men playing some game of chance on the cobblestones. I stood and watched for a few minutes. Then I noticed the crowd was being drawn from some sort of plaza, not far down one of the streets, so I proceeded in that direction. When I reached the plaza, dozens of people were milling about, walking from one eating establishment to the next. I tried saying the name of the Sufi community to those I encountered, but none of them seemed to pay attention or understand me. Suddenly, an old bearded man in a black jalaba grabbed me and started dragging me down an alley from the plaza. "Are you taking me to Sufi community?" I asked. He didn't answer, but kept leading me. Since I hadn't received any kind of response from the people in the plaza, I figured I couldn't lose anything by seeing where this stranger was taking me. Soon, however, I became anxious. There was a light at the entrance to the alley, but as the man led me further and further down the alley, I could barely make out the doorways we passed because of the lack of light. I heard the snarling of dogs and the groans and snores of unseen men. Although I knew I could easily break the grasp of the old man, I started worrying that I was being led toward an ambush in which I would surely lose my meager possessions, if not my life. I started repeating the zikr meant to instill me with courage. The old man continued pulling me down the dark alley. Finally, we turned a corner and stopped. I heard him knock on something, and then a huge wooden brass door opened. The light from behind it illuminated a fairly young boy, who said to me in Spanish, "So there you are at last." Someone called to the boy from inside, and he called back, "The blind man brought him." I turned and looked at the old man beside me in the light from the doorway. For the first time I noticed he had no eyeballs. I was shocked. My breath caught in my throat and I couldn't move. As I stared at his disfigured face, a smile formed on the blind man's lips. The boy beckoned the two of us inside, where he exchanged words with a man in a brown jalaba and white turban. The man introduced himself in English as Abdul Rahman. The boy and the blind man left down a hall to the right, as Abdul Rahman explained that the Muqaddam had been very concerned when I hadn't arrived at the appointed place in Tangiers. He gave me a jalaba and turban to wear and asked me to give him my suitcase for storage. The wall behind him was an intricate repeating pattern of diamond shapes, and he removed the front from one of the dozens of diamond-shaped compartments in the wall, put my bag in the opening, and replaced the front. Seconds later, as he stepped away from the wall, I had trouble remembering where Abdul Rahman had placed my belongings. I gathered that I would have no need of them in this place. I picked up my sleeping bag again. Abdul Rahman showed me to a huge dark room. A half-dozen candles glowed at various points on the floor, illuminating dozens of men sleeping, praying, or reading on reed mats or sleeping bags. As he stepped back and went back into the hallway, Abdul Rahman advised me to get some sleep, because I would start the daily routine in the morning, before sunrise. When he left, I stepped back into the hallway and took off my shirt and blue jeans, and tried on the turban and jalaba. The jalaba was made of lightweight cotton, and was cool and allowed me free movement. I was amazed how comfortable I was after throwing off the constraints of my Western clothing. It took me a couple of tries to tie the turban so that it wouldn't slide down. Eventually, I entered the sleeping chamber again and laid my sleeping bag out on some empty floor space near the far wall. A narrow slit of a window projected moonlight from the courtyard into the room. I heaved a big sigh. I felt like I'd finally arrived at the end of a very long journey. I was in a place where there was no westernization or easternization of teaching. Here was a place where people simply lived lives of spiritual awareness and dedicated themselves to the science of self-discovery and the science of service. I thought about all the teachers I had encountered that seemed to be preparing me for my life here in the Zoya. I recalled the mysterious Lila I'd encountered in Santiago. Then there was Horst and the Tariqa, and the Sufi author Ian I had met in Berkeley. All of them were people with big hearts. The transformational process that was guiding me was a path of the heart. I had studied other techniques and traditions along the way, but it seemed the path of the heart had been the most obvious one I was following, and it didn't matter in what frame of reference or community or belief system or ideology it was immersed. There was always a quality of heart that was central to the experience. My thoughts turned to my parents, and I prayed they were happy and well. This reflection came to me. All around planet Earth, people were yearning for change. This, I knew, was the outward sign of the coming spiritual grace. I felt exhilarated, knowing I could travel anywhere on the globe, and the spiritual energy would find me. The wonder of this realization was similar to when in my early adolescence I discovered the meditation, now is the time. As long as I was focused on this nowness, I could see that the interface between the earthly and heavenly worlds was developing. I prayed to be filled with those things the soul longed for: love, compassion, peace, and joy. I put my awareness in my heart's center and felt these qualities. When I did this, I felt a shift in the energy inside my physical body. I acknowledged this, and my being, my essence, became solidified and empowered with the knowledge of the true being. I knew it did not matter where I was. I could be in the mountains of Peru, Morocco, North America, or Europe. The essence was getting stronger as I continued my journey. As I moved on, I was further awakened to my responsibility for the depth of my own heart. But my prayer was not just for me. I prayed to expand, and I experienced a different energy vortex outside my physical body. On one level, it was a cellular physical energy change. I felt lightness and was filled with joy in a holy community that extended to the whole planet. I could see and feel the light of the planet, could sense the planet alive in myself. I heard an inner voice say, "You are not alone." The power, awareness, and passion of everyone who has ever walked this blessed planet are all available to you if you can transcend the body and the mind. Of the millions who have been released from the limited state of awareness the body and mind allow, many have chosen to assist those who seek the soul. When you call the masters of the past, the present, and the future, you will be answered. When you ask to be filled with a consciousness that allows you to love everything you see and every thought you think, it will happen. You have never been alone, but the present wonder is that you are now closer to us than you have ever been, and this makes us grateful. I slept soundly that night after the many hours of travel without rest. Much too soon for me, though, I awakened in the darkness of the huge room. Someone in the courtyard outside my room was chanting loudly over and over, "There is no God but reality. There is no reality but God." I opened my eyes wider and propped myself on my elbows. In the moonlight that still shone through the narrow window, I could see the other men in the room getting up, rewrapping themselves in turbans and jalabas, and heading out the door. I got up to look out the narrow window. A man circling the fountain in the center of the courtyard called out to the other narrow windows on the courtyard walls. I retied my turban and went into the hall to see if I could find out what was going on. For all I knew, there was a fire, and we were being evacuated from the building. When I got to the hall, the other men were calmly making their way toward the prayer room, so I followed. In the prayer room, the rest of the community had already arrived, and as was the case in everything I was to do in the Soya, the women were on one side of the room and men on the other. I took my place on an empty rug in the front of the room with the other men and faced east, where a piece of parchment with the word Allah, or God, written on it in Arabic calligraphy hung. After a couple of minutes, a very tall young man in a black jalaba and turban entered and stood on a more ornate rug in front of the altar. Everyone else in the room rose, and I recognized the prayer ritual I had seen several times in Berkeley and in the desert during the train ride the day before. I followed the prayers, chanted in Arabic, and performed the usual rituals of prostrating myself, touching my head to the floor, sitting and standing. A long silence followed the prayers, and I noticed everyone sitting with their eyes closed. This was a time for meditation, and I tried to relax and calm my thoughts. I again prayed for the health and happiness of my parents and friends, and also for the betterment of all humanity. Then, hearing another prayer beginning, I opened my eyes. In a minute it was over, and everyone started leaving the room. As I stood alone, the tall young man who had led the prayer approached and introduced me to an older man with eyeglasses, a beard, and thick dark eyebrows. "This is Hassan," the younger man explained, "and he will be your teacher for the time being." As I shook hands with Hassan, the tall young man left. "Have you already met the Mukaddam?" he asked. "No, which one is he?" "That was him," Hassan said with a smile. "You must understand that he is very busy in running the Zoya, and does not always take time to properly introduce himself to the new arrivals. Are you hungry?" In fact, I had not eaten in over 15 hours, and I was starving, but I simply said yes. "You are in luck, then," my bearded teacher replied. "Now we go to breakfast." Hassan led me out of the now empty prayer room, across the courtyard to the dining room. There again, the separation of men and women continued. We sat at the men's table and were immediately served a small bowl of some hot cereal, a grain called couscous. The man to my right asked me to pass him the pitcher of water. I reached forward and grabbed the handle with my left hand, and Hassan yelled at me, "No, put it down." I put the pitcher down and looked over at the man at my right, who looked somewhat aghast. Quickly, one of the servers took away the pitcher and gave the man a new one. Later, in private, Hassan explained that one never offers one's left hand to someone or passes food with the left hand in Arab countries, no matter how clean it is. The routine of that first day was the same on every day at the Zoya from then on. We awakened before sunrise for the morning prayer and meditation. Before every prayer, 5 times a day, everyone trooped into the courtyard to wash their hands, feet, and face in the fountain. Some scrubbed as if they were really trying to clean up, and others barely dipped their hands and feet in the water before moving on. Hassan explained to me that this was called the wuzu, and it is meant to be a ritual cleansing. Most of the members of the community bathed in private. The next part of the mornings, we broke into small groups to study and recite the zikrs. I had learned a couple of the prayers with Horst back in Chile, but there were 99 of them, so there was much to learn. Each prayer represented a name of God, which corresponded to an attribute of God. Though there is only one God, he has many names, just as a man can be called husband, father, son, brother, or friend. Hassan taught the Arabic prayer, what it meant in English, and the conditions under which it should be invoked. Every quality of essence, every quality of God, Hassan taught, has an effect like a medicine when it's repeated. For instance, when you say al-afu, it means the pardoner. The Arabic I will teach you means he who pardons all who repent sincerely, as if they had no previous sin. This is one of the qualities of God, and you can invoke the quality in yourself by repeating the zikr of the pardoner. When you repeat Ya Afu, all your sins become pardoned. Let me give you another example. Let us say a couple is having a relationship problem. If one of them says the zikr of the lover, Al-Wadud, which means he who loves those who do good and bestows on them his compassion, 100 times over some food that is then served to the other spouse, the quarrel disappears. You say Ya Wadud over and over, and that quality in you will come forth. I came to learn that Hassan was also a healer, and that was why the Muqaddam had assigned me to his study group. Hassan saw a great many of the world's troubles caused by a lack of self-esteem, and so he often instructed those in his care to repeat Ya Kabir, or I am great, 100 times each morning. Ya Kabir is the zikr of the Great One, Al-Kabir, Hassan explained. You must understand, Hassan said, that Kabir means the greatness of the soul. It is not meant to make one vain or boost one's ego. When someone's troubles are physically manifested, whether it is fever or coughing or more serious symptoms, the healer often uses the zikr of the peaceful one, or zikr as-salam. The healer repeats Ya Salam, meaning I am at peace, 100 times, over the ill person to invoke the quality in him or her. With a peaceful state of mind comes health, Hassan taught. In the late mornings we were called to exercise, which everyone did in their own way. I did some yogic stretching and took walks around the grounds of the Zoya. After that, we were divided into new groups to prepare lunch. Lunch was a much larger meal than breakfast, and often involved 4 or more courses. But the noon prayer came before we could eat lunch, much like the morning prayer, but without the silent meditation. After lunch, we were assigned chores, just for the afternoon, or chores that remained the same for weeks at a time. I was most often called upon to fix furniture, and because of my height and long arms, to pick lemons and oranges from the fruit trees in the courtyard. I was grateful that the chores seemed to be a part of the devotional life there, and not an interruption. Manual labor is an extension of God's work in this world, Hassan taught. Invariably, I would have my arms full of fruit or be in the middle of recaning the seat of a chair, when the call to learn was sounded. At that point, I had to drop whatever I was doing and go to a group meeting. There, one of the teachers from the Zoya, or a visiting teacher, told stories and talked about various principles of spirituality. When the speaker was Arabic, visitors from Great Britain often translated into English. For several weeks, Ian, the red-haired man, Scott, served as translator or teacher at these sessions. When the group study session ended, everyone went back to their chores until they were interrupted again by the mid-afternoon prayer. Dinner was served just before sundown. The menu often included grains and fruit. On Thursday nights, the night of the poor, we had a special dish similar to honeyed lamb. Dinner was a leisurely meal. Before each bite of food, everyone whispered, Bismillah, in the name of Allah, under their breath. When everyone finished eating, we remained at the tables for more stories and teachings. Here, however, there was more opportunity to ask questions than during the more formal afternoon study sessions. One recurring theme in many of the teachings and stories involved the use of techniques to achieve greater soul awareness. I was taught a metaphor. When you drink something, you pay attention to the drink, not to the bottle from which it came. Over and over, the stories told of followers who became so focused on the techniques they were learning, they performed them like automatons. They were doing the motions and saying the words, but the goal of the technique or prayer had become lost to them. It gave me a new orientation to the various practices I had learned and was learning. Whenever I felt myself performing a meditation, technique, prayer, or ritual automatically, I dropped it until I could do it with the goal clearly in mind. Hassan often said, the magic key of one is the millstone of another. One of the first prayers I learned at the Zoya dealt with the subject of soul awareness quite well, I thought. He who knows and does not know that he knows he is asleep, let him become one, whole. Let him be awake. He who has known but does not know, let him see once more the beginning of all. He who does not wish to know and yet says that he needs to know, let him be guided to safety and to light. He who does not know and knows that he does not know, let him through this knowledge know. He who does not know but thinks that he knows, set him free from the confusion of that ignorance. He who knows and knows that he is wise. Let him be followed. By his presence alone, man may be transformed. After dinner, we would gather for the evening prayer. After the usual prostrations, bowing and standing, however, we formed a circle called the Hazrat. First we would sit facing each other, repeating the zikrs, trying to reach a level of ecstatic surrender so profound it would cause the body to shake and move. Then we would all stand up, join hands, and continue the shaking. I used the breathing and chanting I learned with Ian in Berkeley to achieve a state of mind and body where I could see the others in the group as bodies of light and could spontaneously shake with the rush of energy being evoked. I clearly experienced everyone as part of a connected energy field. We were all beings of light. I overheard Ian during one of his visits explaining the process to an older man who was another newcomer. I feel a little self-conscious during the Hazrat, the older man told Ian during dinner one night. What should I be doing differently? You should not be consciously making your body shake, Ian explained in his low voice and heavy Scottish accent. It is an ecstatogenic technique. An inner force, an inner energy wakes you up. Through the repetition of the zikrs, you short-circuit the connection between the left and right halves of your brain. And as the left and right brains become a more unified field, the unified field allows for perceptions not available in ordinary states of consciousness. After the Hazrat, we retired to our rooms. From there we heard the call from the courtyard after sunset for the night prayer, which we did in private. During my time at the Zoya, I rarely left the estate, and the routine stayed much the same. It was the routine that seemed to confound all the nafs, the little egos Horst had started to explain to me at the Taraka meetings in Santiago. Arrogance, hostility, and pride gradually faded from my experience as I began to lose myself in a more essential communal identity. One of the only exceptions to this routine were the rare visits with the Sheikh, whose wealth supported the Zoya. He was a man in his 70s with 4 wives, 6 children, and about a dozen grandchildren. But even when the rest of his family was not around, the presence of the Sheikh could be felt. Even though he was deeply wrinkled and walked with a cane, he exuded a feeling of wisdom and peacefulness. The first time I met him in person, I introduced myself. He immediately said, "Intention is the true elixir." I turned and watched as one of his servants closed the doors behind me and left us alone together. "Intention gives you strength," the Sheikh continued. "When you are searching for God, when you are studying the holy teachings, it is being in the presence of one who has dedicated his whole life to a specific intention that strengthens your own intention." Our cosmology of the self and higher consciousness is not well understood in the West because it is multidimensional in nature. When your heart is open, you will embody the teachings. You will be like a bee that carries pollen from one plant to another and leaves honey wherever it goes. The heart is meant to revolve. It should always be in motion. If it turns and revolves and does not fixate specifically on any one thing, it will not be pulled or attached to any one situation. I listened attentively as he went on. You can become a free being who is capable of love and is not attached to any particular setting, not even this one. If you can accomplish this, it will be of use to you when you have to make your decision. Your task is to keep your heart turning. When something changes, your heart must turn so that nothing can adhere to it. You can use it like radar or an antenna that receives and transmits signals and always stays connected to the source of love. If your heart is stuck, your ability to help and serve will diminish. This subtlety of the heart is where the truth lies, the truth about your existence and your ability to be a useful member of your community. On the other side, the highest reason will perceive reality and its connection to the divine cause. The highest reason for being is stabilization of consciousness. It never turns. It is always fixated in the Creator. As the Sheikh continued his teaching about intention, I marveled at the opposites his presence embraced. Outwardly, he was not very beautiful, but inwardly, his peacefulness, wisdom, and compassion were astounding. Outwardly, everything about his manner, his clothing, and his surroundings indicated a strict adherence to discipline. But inwardly, his mind ranged from one idea to another, never settling on one perspective as being the right one. I felt so at peace and was learning so much in this place that I couldn't conceive of leaving. I was quite happy and content. But on the morning of my 200th day at the Zoya, Abdul Rahman retrieved me from my study group. He took me to the courtyard and explained I needed to make a choice at that moment. Then he led me to the prayer room where all the other members of the community or facing the altar and chanting, La ilaha illallah, which means there is no God but supreme reality. What am I supposed to decide about? I asked Abdul Rahman, as he had me stand next to the prostrate Muqaddam before the altar. You must leave Habib Yasawa today, Abdul Rahman whispered. You must choose whether you will commit to your life as a fakir in another community in Egypt, or if you will take what you have learned here back to the West. I stood there while the rest of the community chanted for nearly an hour. I had no preparation for this sudden change of plans. I'd never heard of anyone being faced with a decision like this before. I felt very comfortable at Habib Wasawa. When I tried to picture myself living the rest of my life as a Sufi fakir in Egypt, I realized I had forgotten my intention once more. It was not yet my time to settle down and give back what I had learned. I felt in my heart I had much more to learn. So despite how much I intellectually wanted to continue this particular path, I finally turned to the Muqaddam and announced, I will return to the West. Immediately the chanting stopped. The Muqaddam stood up and gestured to two of the others there, who took me to the Sheikh's apartment. As I stood before the Sheikh one last time, he asked me, What have you decided? I will not go to Egypt, I replied. I will return to the West. The Sheikh rose, knowing exactly that I had made the right decision, and crossed to me. He put his hands on top of my head and said, Mash Allah, be the will of God done. At that moment, visions of my path up to that point rushed into my head. I again saw the bigger story, and I knew I was doing the right thing. Minutes later, I was in the foyer of the Zoya with Abdul Rahman. He reached into the wall compartment in which he had stored my small suitcase and took back my turban and jalaba. I changed back into the shirt and jeans I had been wearing when I arrived over 6 months ago, and he opened the door to the street and repeated the Sheikh's blessing. Be the will of God.